Welcome, welcome. Looks like we have a number of familiar faces. Fantastic. Good, good, good. Welcome, welcome. If you'd like to be ahead of the logistical curve, go right ahead and type your full name into the chat. Follow Kim's excellent example. And that way we will have that timestamp of your presence. And we'll just give it a couple of more moments, and then we will go ahead and get started. And again, if you've just joined us and you haven't had a chance to do so yet, please do type your full name into the chat. All right, we'll give it one more minute, folks. We'll go ahead and get started. We have 45 people in the learning community. And if you are sharing your screen with anybody, one of our colleagues are sharing screens. But if you are sharing your screen with somebody who's also participating, please make sure their full name is typed into the chat as well. And do keep in mind, folks, that this is a 2-hour learning community conversation. It's fairly brief. So just keeping that in mind. I will throw out a question that I'm going to ask everybody to consider. We'll take care of the logistics, and then we're going to come back to this question. But I'm going to throw out the question for you to consider at this particular point, because this is a learning community conversation focused specifically on professional boundaries. And my question to you is if we are mandated generally by our licensure or by our organizations to participate in this conversation on at least an annual basis, because sometimes it's more than annually. But for most of us, for me, I'll make an I statement here. For me, it's on an annual basis that I am required to participate in a conversation about professional boundaries and ethics. My question to you, and again, I'm asking you to ponder this. I'm not asking you to give the answer now, your answer, but I'm asking you to ponder. If we're all mandated to do this on an annual basis, and the information doesn't really change, professional boundaries, yes, there's nuance to that. There is evolution to that as new things and new technologies become available. But essentially, most of the information actually remains the same. My question to you for you to ponder, and we'll talk about in the larger group, is why is it then, what do you see as the benefits of us engaging on this topic on an annual basis as a learning community? Because there are 48 of us here. So I'm asking you to ponder that. You don't have to put anything into the chat. You don't have to answer at this particular point, but I'm asking you to consider that because we're going to explore that question. The benefit or benefits of focusing on this particular topic within the context of a learning community at least once a year, even if the information doesn't change. So that's what I'm asking you to think about right now. Okay? All right. Again, I can't thank you all enough for making the time to be here today. My name is Paul Warren. And for those of you who I've had the great privilege of being in learning communities with before, let me start by saying welcome back. And for some of you who I just saw yesterday, welcome back so soon. Great to see you again. And for those of you who I'm meeting for the first time, thank you again for being here and welcome. Very glad to have you in this learning community conversation. We will work together as a learning community. And just by way of brief introduction, my name is Paul Warren. I'm a research project director at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. I'm a senior staff trainer and curriculum writer for the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. And you've probably figured it out that does mean that I am forced at times to go to Puerto Rico, St. Thomas, or St. Croix to train. It's rough, but I have been forced. Exactly. Carrie is playing a very small violin of sadness for me. It's been a very long time that I have been forced. Yeah, and Jeffrey's like, I wouldn't come back. Jeffrey, trust me, the first time I was forced to go, it was in the month of February after having had 15 consecutive snowstorms in New York City. So I got off the plane and I seriously contemplated not coming back, but I did, and I'm glad I did. I'm also very fortunate to have the opportunity to be a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, MINT, which is an international organization that focuses on the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing. And I am a social worker by training and a graduate of Hunter College School of Social Work. I began my direct service career providing direct care to people living with HIV and AIDS in 1991. And I did that to 2003 when I made the transition. That college, Hunter College, is located in New York City. It is now referred to as the Silberman School of Social Work. But when it was Hunter College School of Social Work. And in fact, excellent question, Jeffrey. In fact, Hunter built a beautiful new facility up on the Upper East Side in Harlem, where the classrooms in the school actually is. It moved from sort of the Upper East Side to even further uptown, which was fantastic. And I've had the great opportunity to teach at the new building up in Harlem in the Upper East Side. So very happy to be here with all of you and to be focusing on this particular topic of professional boundaries. We will now take care of a couple of logistical details. There are 52 of us in the learning community. We'll take care of a couple of logistical details, and then we will go ahead and begin our conversation, hopefully our interactive conversation about this particular topic. And I will also just remind you of the question I'm asking you to ponder that after we take care of the logistics, we'll talk about, is that if we are all mandated on an annual basis, at least, to participate in this conversation and to prove that we have credit hours in this particular topic, what is the benefit or benefits of our coming together as a learning community? And why do we come together as a learning community at least once a year to focus on this topic, even though the information and sort of the guidelines don't necessarily change? So that's what I'm asking you to think about right now. And then we'll discuss it after we take care of the logistics. I'm going to share my screen. And if you could just use the chat to indicate with the letter, typing the letter Y, if you can see me and see the slide at the same time. I can't see you when I'm looking at the slides at this moment, but I just want to confirm that you can see me and you can see the slide. Excellent. That's great. Excellent. There are 54 of us here together today. This is meant to be relevant and useful. In addition to getting the credit that you may need, it's meant to be useful for the work that you do, for your well-being, and for the effectiveness of your interactions with your participants, your clients, your patients. What we talk about, what you bring to the table, is important and valuable to this learning community, and it's perfectly okay if it doesn't necessarily reflect the official position of our funder. This is meant to be a relevant and useful learning community conversation. To that end, as we talk about this particular topic, we're all coming from unique and distinct experiences, beliefs, ideas, and information. And that's a benefit, a richness. What I would ask as an overarching guideline is that we all be very intentional and aware of the words we use as we speak to each other. We want to be using language that is welcoming, respectful, and inclusive to all 54 people that are in the learning community, that puts the people in this learning community first, and we acknowledge that the words we use, how we say things, actually does have power. Welcome again, as per the slide. If you would take a moment at the end of our learning community conversation today, and I am going to do my best to build some time in, but if you could take a moment to please complete the brief evaluation, your feedback is appreciated and it's valuable. Once we receive your completed questionnaire, survey, evaluation, we will then, in about 2 weeks, generate your certificate of 2 hours credit. And we will also send you a copy of these slides that you're free to share and use with anybody that you may like. If you have not yet done so, this is the last time I will say it. Excellent. If you have not yet done so, please, Kim, the word ethics is actually not included on the certificate. That's not the title of this course, but certainly it is part of the conversation. So hopefully that will, and if you need to use the slides as validation of that, feel free. Now, you may recall when you registered for the course that you actually agreed to have a working camera and a working microphone and to be on camera and be focused on participating in this particular learning community conversation. Now, having said that, a couple of people have let me know that they're having some camera problems, or it may be that you need to step away for a moment. A moment means a few moments. It doesn't mean 45 minutes. So if you do need to step away during our time and you need to turn your camera off, by all means, don't hesitate to do it. Just send me a private message that says I'm stepping away. And then when you come back, hopefully in a few moments, you'll just turn your camera back on and rejoin us. Okay, so just keeping that in mind. What I would also add is that, oh, and wonderful, I see that people are continuing to add their names in the chat. That's great. And Morgan, thank you for letting me know. Perfectly okay. Very glad you're here. What I would ask, because there are 54 of us, is that you remain muted unless you have something you want to add or comment on or share information or share a reaction. You are more than welcome to interrupt me. I don't mind at any point. I could be in mid-sentence, and if there's something you want to add, don't hesitate to unmute and say, you know, Paul, I'd like to add something here. I'm perfectly okay with that. What I would ask, though, is if Elizabeth or anybody else in the learning community has the floor, please don't interrupt them. Let them make their point, let them finish what they're saying, and then I will do my best to make time for you to comment, react, share your perspective, information, reaction. Also, what I would ask is we have the benefit of having 54 people in this learning community today. Your experience is valuable, it's welcome, and it will be respected here. That's my job, to try and keep this a safe and respectful learning environment. We do not have to be on the same page. We don't have to agree. What I would ask, though, as a guideline, if you hear something in particular that you don't agree with within the context of the learning community, that you offer that person the respect of listening to what it is they have to say. And if you do want to comment or share another perspective, certainly, because we are an active and respectful learning community, you are welcome to do that. The only other guideline that I would ask people to consider and abide by is to please make I statements. I believe this. I had this experience. I know this information. I have this reaction. So I'm going to advance the slide to the goal, but I'm going to take the screen down for a minute, and I'm just going to ask, can everybody agree to those guidelines as stated? You can wave, nod, throw money, type Y in the chat, give a double thumbs up, love it. In tandem, that's fantastic. Okay, good. Good. So those are our guidelines, folks, as we work together for the brief time that we have that's now a little less than 2 hours. Excellent. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. And just to remind you basically that our goal in this conversation is to provide an opportunity to revisit professional boundaries and ethics within the context of our informed learning community and to engage in a conversation about that. And again, we're very fortunate, we're blessed actually to have the presence of 54 people in this learning community conversation today. So let's really take advantage of that. We'll talk about the definition of professional boundaries, maintaining professional boundaries, why professionalism is important, the dangers of dual relationships, and that's essentially our agenda for our conversation today. Now, it's a little bit of a robust agenda for such a short period of time. And what I want to, and I do have a scenario that I'm hoping we're going to be able to get to, time permitting. When these slides were created, because you can all read slides and you can also share slides. When these slides were created, folks, they were created to almost be, I don't know any other way to put it other than to say kind of like a reminder list where you could literally review them and be like, oh yeah, that's one of the things that we really want to be paying attention to. Or, oh yeah, these are some of the guidelines that we actually want to consider if we're interacting with patients or participants digitally. So they were meant to be kind of a post-training support tool that you could use as a reference, or that you could share, or that you could facilitate a conversation about. So if we don't touch on all the slides, you're still going to have them. But my sense is what we talk about in our conversation will probably touch on everything that's in the slides. You'll have them, though, once we get your evaluation. Okay? So just keeping that in mind. They're meant to be a supportive tool, which again, you're free to use or not as you see fit. So I asked folks to ponder a particular question, and I'm going to repeat the question. And I'm wondering, maybe Anita, I'm not sure if you're able to unmute, but if you are, if you would be willing, I'll ask the question again. And if you could share your first reaction to the question, and then maybe we can open it up to hear what other people think as well. If you're okay with that, Anita, you can pass if you'd rather not.
No, sure.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll just restate the question for anybody who maybe came in late, and then Anita's going to start us off. And then I'm wondering maybe if we can go from Anita, maybe to Scott, if that's okay with you, Scott. And again, you can pass. And then maybe to Marita, if you're okay with that, Marita. But again, you can always pass, and then anybody else who wants to jump in. So this was the question that I'm asking everybody to ponder. If we are mandated on an annual basis to revisit this information, and the information doesn't really change. Yes, there are some nuances or whatever, but essentially the basics of professional boundaries and guidelines and ethics kind of remain the same. What is the benefit, or why is it useful for us to revisit this on an annual basis as a learning community? So, Anita, any thoughts, any reactions to that?
Okay, so when you first asked that question, right off the top of my head, I mean, basically, it's always good to refresh, which is why we train anyway,
Right.
always, and to remind us of certain things we may have forgotten because we don't, remember it and put it up on the wall all the time, everywhere. So, and then, I mean, just basically respect as a rule to remember. And, sometimes things change, even though you said the content probably doesn't change much, but we change as well. So we may have had experiences that happened, and our perception of things, maybe our perspective on things might have changed a little bit. So I guess it's good to, as a benefit, to get a refresher.
Fantastic. Anita, thanks so much for starting us off. We're going to
You're
go ahead
welcome.
and go to Scott, and then we'll go to Marita.
Yeah, to piggyback off of what Anita said, I mean, we develop and grow as people. So our views could change slightly, they could change drastically. It's just all about continuing to grow as a person, and I love to learn, and that, certain situations might change my stance on certain areas. So
Super. Thanks. Thanks so much, Scott. Yeah, Marita, we're going to go to you, and then it's open to anybody else who may want to unmute and comment and share their thought or their reaction to that question or their unique kind of take into what Anita and Scott both said. And I'm so glad I asked this question because this doesn't always come out. From a year to year basis, we've probably had a lot of different experiences that may actually change or modify how we feel about this. So I really appreciate Anita and Scott both kind of putting that on the table right in the beginning. Sorry, Marita, you're very patient.
Yeah. Similar to Scott and Anita, one of the things that I thought of when you first asked the question was that our understanding of boundaries may change as we develop more experience and face boundary gray areas we hadn't previously considered or explored in supervision.
Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely. And again, I love that you're also linking it to what we may have explored in supervision, because that can be a huge piece of this process too. As we do our work and we interact with our supervisor or our colleagues, that also impacts what our experience. Absolutely. And I saw that Jeffrey put something in the chat. Let me just check that. Yes, it can be humbling because we may think we are doing things the right way when in reality we are doing them wrong. Absolutely. We could find out. Wrong is a very strong word, but we could find out that there are some need for improvement. And Cami writes, skill improvement, increased confidence, and reinforce of knowledge. Training remains somewhat consistent, but our environments and situations change. These conversations give opportunity to share and learn from experience from others, Sarah adds. Carrie writes, could use some new perspective on rural boundaries in small communities, probably like where dual relationships occur. Yes, running into clients at the grocery store or in a community. Tech and social media are always changing, and it's good to discuss boundaries around them. Change in roles and different leadership, we may need to revisit the conversation. For me, it is based on where I am working, such as working as professional in a host environment, evolving minds, perspectives, and guidelines. Yes. Okay. Anybody else want to unmute and comment on this? Why it might be beneficial for us to revisit this, even though we're mandated. But what are some? Yeah, go ahead, Kelly. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Kim.
I was just going to say that I think this is a good space to actually say things out loud as well. So when it comes to dual relationships, there's a lot of, somebody said the word wrong. So sometimes it's hard to say these things out loud. So this is an opportunity to actually, and not specifics, but talk about these with other human beings instead of, the narrative going on in your head.
Yeah. And Kelly, thank you for saying that, because I will throw this out as a consideration inspired by what Kelly just said, that one and actually I believe it was Marita who alluded to this at first, but I want to connect what Kelly and Marita are saying, which is that actually saying it out loud and talking to other people about it is part of the process of maintaining and establishing ethical and professional behavior. Because sometimes you do need to check it out during supervision with a trusted colleague in a learning community. And, Kelly, you make me you make me think of a phrase that I've heard in recovery communities that I think is very relevant to this. And I'm going to say the recovery community phrase, but then I'm going to translate it into sort of the helper, sort of I don't know if anybody's ever heard the phrase, an addict in his own mind is behind enemy lines. Well, Carrie's heard it. I would suggest that a social service provider in his own mind, not talking with colleagues or supervisors about these situations, is behind enemy lines, because that's where things can really start to go downhill. Kelly, are you okay with me kind of attaching that way of thinking to what you said?
Well stated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Kim, thanks for your patience. Go ahead. The floor is
No
yours.
worries. I'm learning. So, for me, the reason I'm taking today's session is because situations always come up. Someone earlier talked about the gray areas. For me, it's like all gray areas, because I supervise other chemical dependency counselors, and then I have people I work with on my own in outpatient treatment. And, to me, it's like I can't get enough of these, not just reminders, but learning from other people's situations. Well, this happened, or this happened with this person, and getting that feedback. And just learning more and more about professional boundaries is so important for me, because I'm kind of a free spirit. And, I always have to check my own, role and my professional boundaries and the people I work with. And then, of course, you being the instructor, I mean, how could I not take this course?
Flattery will get you everywhere.
Everywhere.
The course is still 2 hours, Kim. I'm sorry.
Oh, shoot.
So thank you so much. I'm glad you're here too. So I want to touch on something that Kim says, and it prompts me to want to do a spontaneous poll, because Kim and others have alluded to the fact that sometimes with professional boundaries, there can be murkiness, it can be gray, okay? And that's a reality, and that's partly why I think, based on what Marita said, based on what Kelly said, it can be so important to talk to other people about it. It does prompt me to want to ask a question, though. And I'm going to ask this question in such a way that I'm going to ask you to reply in the chat. And Octavius, don't lose your thought, because I think you're unmuted. Maybe you want to say something. So don't lose your thought. But I just want to ask this question first, if that's okay. Is that okay?
No.
Okay. So, and Kim, you inspired this question. Kim alluded to the fact that there are gray areas. My question to you is, when you think of professional boundaries, are there any areas that are definitively not gray? They are bright red lines that we don't cross. And if any of that pops into your head, Nicole's shaking her head, yes, there are some bright red lines. So if there are any bright red lines that you can think of, type them into the chat. What are the bright red lines? And I'm going to just read some of these out loud. Boundaries get tested every day. Oh, hold on just a second. Duty, sex, don't have sex with clients, sexual harassment, duty to report child abuse and neglect. My professor always repeats, don't sleep with your clients, sexual relationships, intimate relations, non-consensual touch, race, religion, politics, age, sex, report mandated romantic relationships with clients, child abuse reporting. Number one on my list is no sexual relationships, business relationships with, again, Robert, you're referring to a form of a dual relationship, which a sexual or romantic relationship would be a dual relationship too. Duty to report elder abuse. Thank you for adding that. Any fraudulent activity, free services, flirting toward the clients. Yes. So I just want to be clear, folks. There are accepting gifts, not mandating reporting, right? Not accepting gifts, mandated reporting, and not having sex, financial involvement with clients. So I just want to underline, folks, there are some bright red lines too. And Nicole, I saw that when I asked that question, you seem to have a very strong reaction to it. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to say a little bit about that. Actually, Nicole, before you do that, we're going to go to Octavius. Octavius, thank you. I saw that you remuted, and it reminded me that you were unmuted. Go ahead, Octavius. The floor is yours, and then we'll go to Nicole. Octavius, you're muted. I see your mouth moving, but we don't hear you. Go ahead. There you go.
Yeah, when we were in training during college, each semester we was marched into the auditorium, and once again, ethics. I was always wondering why each semester are we taking an ethics class?
Yeah.
Once you get out in the field, you understand why each semester you had to take an ethics class. But
yeah,
it reminds you, if this is something that consistently they want you to really process.
Yeah.
The vulnerability of a client coming to you and you ethically pass boundaries that you should not.
Yeah. Yeah. And Octavius, thank you for adding that. And I want to underline a distinction that you made, because I think it's a really critical one. I could see you being marched into the auditorium for your annual ethics conversation. And I could certainly understand in the safety of that auditorium why you might be asking, well, why do we keep talking about this every year? And then you made the distinction about getting out in the field. Because actually being in the field, actually doing the work, and Octavius, there's a word that popped into my head, and I'm curious as to what your reaction to this is that when clients or patients come to us, when they make these requests, when we're in the field, we are subject to the possibility of having our ethical foundation or our boundaries eroded because of the nature of the work. Am I kind of capturing the spirit of what you were communicating?
Correct, because you have to understand your boundaries, what you can and cannot do, should not do, and will not do. And no need to mislead a client, especially if they coming to you for care.
Yep. Yeah, and you didn't use this, you didn't say this, but again, you did say it, because you said the client is coming to you for care, which implies in that role you have a higher degree of power, and you are dispensing something that the client needs. So they are at a disadvantage, and you don't want to exploit that relationship.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Octavius.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. So, Nicole, bright red lines, thought, reaction?
Yeah. So, I mean, like we knew that obviously everyone was going to say, don't have sex with your client. Clearly, like, don't do that. And especially if you work with people of all ages, right? But we're hearing about this on the news, and we're horrified, and we think, oh my God, like, how could anybody let this happen? What kind of professional would do this? And that's why I said what I said in that all-encompassing non-consensual touch, because we need to be also having those conversations with our clients, because how much touch is okay for them, because maybe a client wants a gentle touch on the hand, maybe a client wants a gentle hug, maybe not. Like, I work with kids are huggers, okay? But we have, as professionals, have to say, how much are we willing to allow a child to hug us or whatever, because The reality is that these lines do get blurred and they can happen to anyone.
Nicole, could I ask you a brief follow-up question?
Yes.
Because I hear the passion behind what you're saying and the sincere inquiry in what you're saying, and I agree with you 100%. So my question to you is, and I hopefully will hear from a couple of other people too in regard to this, but my question to you is, and I love the way you described it. That's why I love being in the learning community, because you described it like, we hear on the news that these professionals, cross these boundaries and they started a romantic or a sexual relationship with somebody. And we think to ourselves, what kind of professional is that person? How could they do it? And my question to you is, because what I really heard you say is that could be any one of us in this learning community. So Mike, and again, of course, we wouldn't intentionally necessarily set out to do that. But my question to you is if we know that red line is there, how is it that this still happens?
Right, because I think we're not having those conversations like we keep saying. We have to have the conversations with others and with ourselves to say, what is our own personal boundary? What am I willing to do, and to hold that line with yourself, be accountable to yourself. Because I know there are some clinicians who say, I just don't hug kids. I just don't. That's my policy. I just don't. And so you pick your policy, you pick your boundary, and you stick with that. You don't change it, and you be accountable to yourself.
Fantastic. Nicole, thank you so much. And I asked that same question. Yeah, and Jeffrey writes, better be safe than sorry. Absolutely. Absolutely. So Mike, I asked that same question to everybody else. If we know that this is a bright red line, how is it that, and Nicole, I agree with you 100%. It's because we're not necessarily having conversation with ourselves. We may not necessarily be having conversations with our trusted colleagues like Kelly and Marita, or we might not be having conversations with our supervisors. So we're kind of keeping it under the radar. But why else, folks, do you think this happens? Why do you think that these bright red lines actually still get crossed? Marita just wrote something in the chat. Let's take a look. Hold on a second. Even though we are constantly told about don't have sex with clients, I know highly respectable clinicians, counselors who've crossed that line. I am baffled by this every time. When we are talking about this, we say, oh, no, never. But then working with a client where high vulnerability is shared, those emotional and physical boundaries can be crossed, especially when active supervision is not available or accessed. Yep. So again, you're linking it to that maybe we're not having the conversations we need to have, and you're also acknowledging it's the intensity of the work. Jeffrey writes, I think we would have to assess each person and situation individually to really know. I agree. Burnout, Kelly says, you forget your why. And Jean says, the approach to the red line can always be gradual and incremental. So we sneak up to the red line and it sometimes fades or moves. In general, human relationships are murky and gray. Yes. And that's why and I'm going to go back to what Nicole said, we need to be checking in with ourselves and questioning and engaging in dialogue with our colleagues and our supervisors. And I want to underline what our colleague put in about burnout. Because if we're experiencing compassion fatigue or burnout or vicarious trauma, we are more susceptible to carry. Do you want to say something about that, Carrie?
No, I can just really identify with that of the ability to watch ourselves and when we are in that place of burnout, how we can be so much more susceptible to items of that kind of nature. and how burnout can creep up on you,
Yeah.
you know, just like the disease of alcoholism, burnout is cunning, baffling, and powerful too,
Yeah.
you know, and you got to watch out for it. So I really think you hit something on the nose there. And I just wanted to say you hit it on the nose.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I see that Cole put in the chat, I think these lines get crossed because some individuals begin to feel more connected to their clients than they do to the world outside of the office. Yes, I would certainly agree with that. And it could be that as the world outside the office shrinks, and the clients, yeah, go ahead, Michelle. Go ahead. I see, Michelle, you have your hand up. Go right ahead.
You know, everybody has opinions and thoughts and feelings about this, and
Yes.
that's great. For me, I cannot possibly, no way, shape, or form. That is something that should never happen. And
No.
maybe I'm not getting honest with myself or with my supervisor during supervision, because that's when you would know about transference, counter transference, whatever the case may be.
Yep.
And you just don't take advantage of people. And if you burnt out, maybe you need a vacation to regroup and come back to what you claim you love.
Yep. Yes. Thank you so much, Michelle. Absolutely.
That's just something I strongly don't agree with, that behavior.
Understood. Understood. And I would venture to guess that probably everybody in this learning community, all 58 of us, are on the same page about that. We would not, in our heart of hearts, want to harm or take advantage. And again, it's kind of answering partly this question of why we come together on an annual basis, and sometimes more than annually, to focus on this, to get it out on the table, and to remind ourselves of these things. So thank you so much, Michelle. I'm going to go to Kristen. Go ahead, Kristen. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so when I had a supervisor once that was like, why did you go into social work or counseling or whatever it is that you're in, right? Because she had the thought that like a lot of people in the helping profession realm come into this because they want to be the person they needed when they were younger, right? So there's like a reason, there's a trauma, there's a family history, there's some reason why we get into the helping profession. Yep. And if, like, you know, the saying, like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So we have all these good intentions to help and save the world and lead all these people down the positive paths and give them all the skills. But if you're not doing that on your own internal self-work, maybe that led you to the helping profession, then I have seen where boundaries get blurred. Like, we have all these good intentions and we want to help, but it can quickly turn unethical.
Yeah. Yeah. And Kristen,
challenging ourselves.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting that I want to underline and tell me if I'm getting the spirit of what you're saying, because, you know, if you think about it, folks, already there's a lot of richness on the table in regard to this topic. And if you walked away with one thing, and I hope you walk away with more than one, but if you walked away with one thing, Kristen just said, and Kristen, I couldn't agree with you more. We all come to this work for very personal, often, and very unique reasons that prepare us for the work, draw us to the work. And part of being ethical and professional is continuing to focus on and do our own growth work. Am I getting the spirit of that right, Kristen? That part of being an ethical person is asking yourself, you know, what did draw me to this work? And it's funny, when you asked that question, Kristen, I immediately had my answer as to why I do this work. And trust me, That's involved a lot of individual therapy for me, a lot of group therapy for me, a lot of supervision and peer supervision for me to be able to continue to be effective and maintain my boundaries. Yeah. So if you're walking away with anything from today's conversation, just walk away with that really important reminder of that we're all drawn to this work and we all have our own work to do as providers as well, because we're people, we're human beings, and we're human beings doing this service. And Carrie says, hold on in the chat, about returning to something. Let me just read that. Could you please return to the concept to feeling more connected to our clients than the outer world? And Carrie, what's your thought about that, or what would you like to explore about that more?
Well, there was a comment above, and we were getting into a conversation, and then we kind of jumped out of it, and you were kind of going into it, and I was just really wanting to hear your viewpoints on that. Sometimes when we see more of our clients, then we get to the point where we see our outside world. Some of us are working from home. Yeah. Some of us, our only interaction may be with clients all day long. And by the time we get home, yeah, we may be introverts, or we may not communicate a lot with the outside world. So after a while, it's like that's the majority of our socialization or something like that. Do you have any suggestions in those areas, or some areas to help combat that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that that's a slightly different conversation. I think these are related, but it's a slightly different conversation because of the need for anybody who's in human services to focus on wellness and self-care. And don't misunderstand me, folks. When I say wellness and self-care, I don't mean bubble baths and massages. And yes, those may be part of your wellness and your self-care. And that's great. But I'm talking about it on a larger level in relation to what Carrie is questioning about, because if your world starts to shift and work becomes the primary focus, and Carrie, I'm going to give you a very specific example from my own experience, but when your work starts to shift where it becomes the larger portion of your life, be aware and question, like our colleagues have been saying, is why is that? What is that doing to me? And talk about that with your colleagues, your supervisors, the people in your program, and figure out, is there something that you need or something that needs to happen for you to right size the impact of the work? So I want to give a very concrete example. And Carrie, it's funny, you asking this question brought this example back to me like a lightning strike. I was you may recall I mentioned that I provided direct services to people living with HIV and AIDS from 1991 to 2003. Now, if you know anything about the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that was a very intense and very dark time until 1996, when we got highly active antiretroviral therapies. So it was basically 6 years of a parade of consecutive death after death after death. And that was death of colleagues, that was death of patients, death of clients. And I remember very specifically, Carrie, sitting in a group supervision meeting. Okay. I was helping to provide supervision to this group of volunteers who were providing direct services. And by the way, these volunteers also had a code of ethics, and they had boundaries and guidelines that they were supposed to follow in regard to how they were interacting with clients. And I'm particularly thinking of Kelly and Marita as I tell this story, because this volunteer shared with the larger group. Now, fasten your seatbelts here, folks. This person was a buddy. They were providing one-on-one care in people's homes. And this person shared in the group supervision, you know, I keep having this feeling that if I just had sex with these clients, their lives would get better. Exactly. Anita's covering her mouth too. Wow, right? And this person shared this. And I have to tell you, thank God he shared it and didn't do it. He shared it and didn't do it. Because the intensity of the work, the fact that he was burnt out, that was the feeling that he was left with. That somehow if he could make that kind of physical connection with the clients, that kind of emotional, sexual, physical connection with the clients, that somehow it would help the situation. But thank goodness he put that on the table and he didn't do it. He didn't cross the boundary. Michelle, I see your hand is up. Go right ahead.
You already said it, and my brother in here, Jeffrey, alluded to it as well. I commend them because they had the ability to be honest.
Yes.
And to say it, that's great that y'all had group supervision, because not only was he getting the supervisor's feedback, he was getting the coworkers' feedback. Yeah. And it didn't matter to him about people's oohs and ahs. That wasn't important. Yeah. He needed to come clean so that he or she don't act out. And I commend them tremendously. It's better to say that than to act in a behavior that is definitely unacceptable.
Exactly.
Because you got vulnerable people that I claim to want to help. And how dare me take advantage of someone that needs the help.
Absolutely.
Shame on me.
Yep. And it would have been taking advantage. And again, I agree with you, Michelle. I commend that person too. And clearly, it's funny, Carrie, I haven't thought of that since probably 1993. And what you said brought it back to me like that. And yes, one of our colleagues put in the chat that yes, it's probably sexualized countertransference. And it clearly, as Nicole was saying, or as others were saying, and actually I think it was Kristen who said this too, that clearly this individual, it's great that they said it. It's great that they put it on the table. They didn't do it. And it also implies there's more reflection and work that individual is going to do, because that's what came up for them. And to Michelle's point, that it's very powerful to be that honest and to own what's going on in service of not harming the patient or the client. And Michelle, you're absolutely right. He was risking a lot of judgment by putting that out on the table. And I have to tell you, it was received with such respect and generosity, because I'll put it to you this way, he wasn't the only person who had that reaction. Because people were at their wits' end as to how to prevent people from dying. So I just give that as a very specific example from my own supervisory experience, and what a powerful example of owning the truth, and to Michelle's point, of not acting it out and causing harm. That's what professional boundaries is about, folks. Simply that. I'm going to share my screen. And again, by all means, if there's anything that anybody wants to say, comment on, or react to, or underline, don't hesitate to unmute. So I think we've made it very clear about professional boundaries and about not crossing particular lines, and some of the things that make us susceptible to crossing particular lines. And I'm going to ask everybody to please type what the word ethics means to you in the chat. So when you hear ethics, what does that mean to you? Aurora says, I'm in agreement with everything that is said previously. However, not only sexual relations are red flags in professional boundaries, sharing information from one's personal life, also crossing professional boundaries. And Aurora, I wonder, and we can hold off on the answer to this question about ethics. Aurora, are you able to unmute? Would you be able to elaborate on that? Because you're touching on yet another, perhaps murkier line that we have to really explore maybe in a little more detail. So I don't know, Aurora, if you're able to unmute, but if you are, would you be willing to unmute and say a little more about this very important point that you've just put on the table?
I don't know if everybody could hear me. Good
We can
morning.
hear you loud
My
and
camera is
clear.
not working. Yes. So
Yeah.
the reason I brought that up, because I used to be a peer advocate supervisor. In our supervision with my supervisors, they were like peer advocates. So you have to share your lived experience with the people that you are working with. But I always get that question, how much do they share with their peer, just to make that connection, because you have to have the lived experience in order to be a peer advocate, right, in substances. So I always suggest that you redirect, because it's not about me, it's about you. You redirect, not to go into details about your personal life. But I feel like this particular part of professional boundaries get blurred a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you put it on the table, because what we're talking about here, and let's name it, we're talking about self-disclosure, and we're talking about personal use of your lived experience. Okay. And Aurora, I'm going to throw out two things, and I'd be very curious as to what your reaction to these two things are about use of personal self-disclosure and use of lived experience. And I'm gonna throw these two things out, and I'd really appreciate if you'd react to these two parameters. And the parameters are these: proportion and purpose. And what I mean by that is the amount or proportion of your personal disclosure as it presents during the conversation. Like, how much is it of you talking about your personal experience? And what's the purpose of your sharing that's making that self-disclosure? So, Aurora, any thoughts about proportion and purpose in regard to the use of self-disclosure or lived experience? And we can open that up to others too, but since Aurora put this on the table, I want to invite Aurora to comment on it first. If you're willing, Aurora. I don't know if you're able to or you're willing. But I just wanted to get a sense of.
Yeah. So to what I understand, when you say proportion and purpose, the proportion is the how much are you willing to share?
Or how much are you sharing?
How much are you sharing? Yes. How much are you sharing? And the purpose is it for you to show to your peer or the person that you're working with that they are able to get out of whatever situation that they are in? Or you're trying to, I don't know, make them feel like, okay, they can do it, but look at me. I did it, you can do it too. In
Okay.
that
So
sense.
as a model, as a role model. Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna use a very current example that just occurred in our learning community. Because I actually just made an I statement, a personal disclosure of my experience when I was in a supervision group about what this person, now that was a personal disclosure. That was a use of my lived experience. Now, what I'm going to ask you to evaluate, and I welcome your honest evaluation of this, was the duration or the amount that I told you about that experience appropriate to our learning community? And was the purpose of my sharing that personal lived experience appropriate to our learning community and our conversation? So I'm going to ask you to think about those two things. Do you think that that personal disclosure was relevant, the right size, and within the keeping of the purpose of our work? So if you think it was, type the letter Y in the chat. If you don't think it was, type the letter D in the chat. So far, and if you don't think it was appropriate, feel free to say so. If you feel free to comment on that. But what I have to do as the person facilitating this learning community conversation is ask myself, how much detail, how long should that story be? And is it relevant to what's going on in this particular moment? And it's the same process when, yeah, the question, Cole, yeah, I can certainly repeat it. The question is I used a self-disclosure and a personal use of my own lived experience as a way to make a learning point. And Jeffrey, you're absolutely right. It can be difficult to decipher at times, like how long, how much, what's the purpose? And the thing I want you to be very clear on, folks, is these are questions that you do want to be asking yourself. And keep in mind, folks, peer educators, peer counselors are professionals. They are bound by organizational, professional ethics and guidelines. And yes, one of the riches, one of the great tools that they bring to their interactions with their patients is their lived experience. And it's about being able to share that lived experience in such a way that is appropriate to the moment and doesn't cross a boundary, doesn't change the nature of the conversation. Yeah. Hold on, I'm just quickly checking the chat. We deal with vulnerable, Jeffrey's saying, we deal with the vulnerable, so we would be best to guard them and not harm. Absolutely, Jeffrey. And we want to constantly be aware of the fact that there's a power differential there. Now, I had asked you to think about what you think of when you think of ethics. And I know a couple of people put some things in the chat, but what I'd love to do, if it's okay, and you can pass if you don't want to do this, but if it's okay, I'm just going to randomly pick 4 people. And I'm just going to ask you to share the first thing that pops into your head when you think of ethics. And again, I'm just asking you, there's no right or wrong in regard to this. Okay? So I'm just asking you, and if you're willing to respond, you can unmute and respond. And if you'd rather not, you can just say pass, or you can give me a thumbs down, like I'm not interested in responding. And that's okay. That's perfectly okay here. So I'm just going to randomly ask a couple of people. And Robert Adams, if it's okay, can I ask you first? And I wonder if Robert's going to say, I knew you were going to pick me.
No, a word that comes to mind is integrity.
Fantastic. Thanks for starting us off, Robert. Integrity. Fantastic. And I'm wondering if Jean Stores, if you'd be willing to unmute, and what's the first thing you think of when you think of ethics?
Think of behaving responsibly.
Thank you. Behaving responsibly. Okay. And maybe Cassie, if you'd be willing. Cassie says, no, I am not willing. Okay, no problem. And maybe Gay, would you be willing? What's the first thing you think of when you think of ethics?
Guiding principles.
Guiding principles. Fantastic. And maybe we can also hear from Cole. Cole, thoughts? Thank you, Gay.
I would just say like what to do and not what to do. Probably that's what I would say, ethics wise.
What to do, what not to do. Fantastic. And maybe we can hear from one more person. I'm wondering, Autumn, if you're able to unmute, would you be willing to unmute?
Yeah,
first?
just professional boundaries and kind of expectations.
Professional boundaries and expectations. Okay. Yep. And you actually prompt me to ask one other person if it's okay. Jennifer, Ross, anything that pop into your mind when you think of, and Tammy just wrote morals and integrity in the chat. Go ahead, Jennifer. Thanks.
Yes, I also agree with integrity and honesty.
Integrity and honesty. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So folks, keep in mind that, you know, what we're really trying to get at here, and actually, I was going to say integrity, morals, and values. Ashley, thank you. And if anybody else wants to put anything else in the chat, or if anybody has a burning desire to unmute and verbalize what they would say when they think of ethics, please feel free. Nicole?
I
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
want to speak to that. I think that we're all probably different professions. And so when I think of ethics, and this is a conversation, I'm a school-based clinician, so I work with different professionals at the schools. And at one point there was a question about how a situation was handled, and we all followed our own ethics. And so you can think of each professional's ethics sort of like a layer of Swiss cheese, and we all layer our ethics and guiding principles to make the best choices possible for our clients and students, if you will. But just that collaboration of layering different ethics, and that maybe your ethics don't address this but my ethics do, or they address it this way or yours address it this way. How can we collaborate and work together to make sure that we're all aligning to our own ethics and morals and integrity and honesty and all those great things that people have said in the chat?
Yes. And that there's an alignment to protect the student, to protect the patient, to protect the client. And we're all kind of coming together, even if we do have different quote unquote ethical codes. Yeah, and Jeffrey's making an interesting point about how ethics can also be linked to your own sort of childhood growth experience, what you learned in your family. And again, those are your personal ethics and your personal boundaries. And you may belong or be licensed. Who here is bounded by a professional code of ethics based on your licensure? If you are, raise your hand, wave. Yeah, absolutely. As am I. As am I. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, like, when I think ethics, I think of like my ethics, like my governing board, right? So who signs and who provides me with my license. Whereas a lot of times I've heard like morals being thrown out. And for morals, I think of my like own internal, like you said, internal ethics versus external ethics, because those things don't always align, right? I might think something's okay, but my ethics through, you know, my license say this is not okay, or vice versa. Ethics might not touch on it, but it might be a personal boundary or a moral thing for me. So it's important to remember that those things are not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely. And so well said, Kristen, because the idea that all of those personal elements that Jeffrey referred to, that you're alluding to, are layered on top of what we may ascribe to in terms of our licensure or our profession or the context we're working in, whether we're working in a school, because there may be guidelines and parameters that guide us there. And sometimes there are differences between them. Well, and I'm going to give a concrete example based on what was talked about. Some people may think it's perfectly okay to hug a kid. And your ethics may say, your written, professional ethics may say no physical contact with patients or clients. Now, you may think that's okay, but your licensure board says no, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for you to keep your license, you have to follow what the licensure board says. And if you know that there's a disconnect there, you of course need to know that. Jennifer, I see that you're unmuted. Go ahead if you wanted to comment. Jennifer.
Oh,
Ross.
sorry, I didn't mean to.
Okay, no problem. But since you were unmuted, is there anything you'd add?
No, I agree with everything. I think it's a conflict, right? And we have to battle that and be aware that our morals are in our judgments impact the way we interact with other individuals. And I think just understanding and being aware of that is going to be key to understanding boundaries of both you and the client.
Thank you. And there's a phrase that Jennifer said that I really, really, really want to underline, because I agree with you 100%. And I love that you're thinking of it this way, Jennifer, and that you articulated it this way. Our values, our morals, and our beliefs have the potential to shape and impact how we interact with that student, with that client, with that participant. And we have to constantly be checking, are they creating conflicts or barriers to fairness, to respect, to good service provision? And the beauty of being a human service worker is that you can believe whatever you believe. You can ascribe to whatever values you ascribe to. And your mission, if you choose to accept it and carry it out ethically, is to not allow your personal values or beliefs to negatively impact your ability to provide services. Because if you can't do that, and I'm going to make a very strong statement here, if you can't do that, maybe service provision isn't the right job for you. Because your role is to be able to provide effective, fair, respectful care to anyone who you happen to have the opportunity to interact with. Are you okay with my saying that? If you agree with that statement, type an A in the chat. If you think I've made an overstatement there, please type an O, because I would love for us to explore that if that's the case. Just because I may be a licensed social worker, it doesn't mean that, I have to change my values or my beliefs. What it does mean is that I have to be able to fulfill what those ethical guidelines tell me is my job. Gay, the floor is yours. Go right ahead.
So I was just thinking about in the organization in which I'm employed through the judiciary, we have a code of conduct. And the code of conduct for the judiciary, someone wrote in the chat, and I wasn't able to go back and see because I'm not that tech savvy, but someone addressed that in the chat about if we were able to just understand our organization's ethical guidelines, then a lot of times that would minimize the potential of any sort of boundary overstepping. So when I think about our code of conduct at the judiciary and my my morals. They don't necessarily align. However, they come together so that it allows for me to have the boundaries that people have talked about in my relationships with the clients that we service in our court, as well as colleagues and as well as the public at large.
Yeah. And again, the thing that I really want to underline in terms of, and Gay, I think you just gave a wonderful example of professionalism, an element or an aspect of professionalism. And what I mean by that is that part of being a professional is knowing where you stand personally and how that stance is in alignment or not in alignment with what your code of conduct may be or what your ethical guidelines might be. And that's part of being a professional. And being a professional means that you may know that there's a disconnect between those and you're still able to do your job. You're still able to follow the guidelines, the professional code of conduct that's laid out for you. That's what being a professional is in one element of it. There are many elements of it, but one element. Okay. Van Jones, have to ask, any comment, any thought, any reaction at this particular point to what we are saying? And you can unmute if you have a comment. No, nothing to add? Hello, everybody. Okay, fantastic. Good. So you typed a lot of people's names in the chat. Great, fantastic. Okay, excellent. If anybody from your massive group has anything they want to say, feel free to unmute and they can approach the microphone if there's anything they want to add. No? Okay, fine. Just wanted to check. Yeah, go ahead, Nicole, please go right ahead.
I want to speak to that about learning the ethics of your organization, because the reason I'm really looking into the boundaries, and I've said this a couple times, but like as a clinician working in a host environment, I know my ethics as a social worker. I know my ethics as my agency, but what is my role as a school-based clinician within the school? Because role confusion, I think, is another common area of boundary crossings or boundary violations, where the school staff will ask me to do things that is not within my role. And also, I am not to be integrated into that school community fully, because I'm a part of it, but I'm also separate from it. Yes. So this is where the boundaries are blurred. And what is my role? I'm not there to watch these children. I'm not their disciplinarian, right? So that role confusion can be very difficult.
Yes, and you're also describing that on sort of a programmatic or organizational, institutional basis. But imagine role confusion between the provider and the patient, or the worker and the student. So our being very clear about what our lane is, what we do and what we don't do, communicating that to our colleagues and the programs, and clearing up any misconceptions about that. Because Nicole, you paint kind of a compelling picture where I could imagine your colleagues may say, well, you're here, you should be doing this. And it's sort of like, actually, no. That's not what I should be doing, because that's not within the scope of my work, and that would be confusing to everybody. And it may not be what you're trained to do as well. And being very clear about that in regard to our interactions with our patients or our clients, so that they're very clear about what we actually are there to do and what we're there to provide to them. Thank you, Nicole. Excellent, excellent point. I'm going to share my screen again. So, boundaries, we know that there may be ethical codes, and there are boundaries that are related to our ethical codes. We also may have, as our colleagues in the learning community have touched on, there can be organizational or programmatic codes of conduct, expectations, boundaries, and we then intermix that with what our personal values and what our personal choices may be. And in some ways, there probably is a difference between ethics and boundaries. And I think it's also fair to say that there's great overlap in terms of how they interweave and how ethics can actually inform boundaries that are in place. I'm going to just share these few purposes, and I'm going to ask you to read these 7. And I'm going to ask you to vote if you were going to prioritize which one of these. I've randomly numbered them 1 through 7. But what I'm going to ask is if you were going to prioritize which one of these you thought was of the highest priority. Boundaries set parameters. Boundaries help protect and inform both workers and clients. Boundaries give workers confidence. Whichever one, I'm going to ask you to use the chat. Read these, but I'm going to ask you to use the chat and identify which one to you might be of the highest priority. And again, I'm asking you to subjectively respond to that. 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 4, 4. Sounds like a song. 2 and 4. I love it. 2 and 4. I asked you to pick one. I know it's hard. 2, 2. I feel encompasses the other 6. 1, 2, 4, 2, 1, 6, 2, 6. Okay. So I'm going to look at these again myself. And I want to ask a general question to the learning community. And maybe one person who might be willing to unmute and comment on this. I asked you to identify which one of those 7 do you see as the highest priority. Now, I do have to report Melissa just says 2 because all of them fall under this category. Understood. I do want to note, though, that not everybody said 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So my question to you is why didn't you all pick exactly the same one? And is there anybody who'd be willing to comment on that? Or yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey. Why do you think?
Because everybody has a different point of view, probably. That would be my guess.
Yes, and I would agree.
That's fine.
I would agree with you 100%. Yeah. Yeah.
But I said 4 for
You
me
said
first because trust in working with people, trust is the most important thing. That's the only way we can progress at all, in my opinion.
Understood.
As simple as that, really.
Okay. And thanks for making an I statement. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Well, you had asked why you think you came up with the different answers. And I know as soon as you asked it, I immediately went to personal experience. Like, where has it helped me the most? So I feel like that's probably why everyone kind of digs into their own personal experiences.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So the reason I love that little sort of opportunity, that little window, is because it's very subjective and we each individually prioritize based on a lot of different individual factors. All of those are true. All 7 are true, but we may think that some are more important than others. And the only point I'd like you to take away from that is be aware of your perspective.
So
yeah, go ahead. Haley, do you want to say something?
Avery if it was any, did she do a no? And she said no, because it was kind of.
Okay, I'm muting Haley because I think she's having a conversation with somebody else. So I'm gonna, unless Haley, you want to comment on something, that would be great. Okay. All right. Excellent. I'm going to share my screen again.
I would like to comment real quickly.
Go right ahead. And
it
doesn't even have to be quickly, Michelle. Go ahead.
I could not prioritize out of the 7.
Okay.
I couldn't get one of the 7. I just thought they all were important. But then I looked at the word parameter. Is only what came to my mind, but I really couldn't prioritize any one over the others.
Understood. Understood. And you're attaching importance to all of them.
Yes, I really was.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm sharing the screen with you again because and I don't know if you can actually see this image clearly as I can. Hopefully you can see it as clearly or more clearly than I can. But I love this picture, and I think it's so appropriate for this because what it says on that ice there is on thin ice. And
yeah.
I only wanted to comment on that is that the professional's role is to establish and maintain professional boundaries. And maintenance takes work. It's not a one and done. And I just wanted to underline this idea, and that's part of the reason we come together, hopefully on an annual basis, to discuss professional boundaries and ethics, is because that's part of the maintenance. It's part of what we're focusing on as a way to maintain and to revisit professional boundaries and ethics. So we know that the professional is responsible for establishing and maintaining these boundaries with their clients, their patients, their students. We know also that we are in a position of power because of our role, and we are kind of the gatekeepers of knowledge and services to the people who come to us for help. And we also know that the professional does not misuse or abuse the position of power by crossing boundaries. And that's always the intention, that we're seeking to make sure that we don't cross those boundaries, because again, we don't want to do harm. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen to emphasize this point. We don't want to do harm to ourselves. We don't want to do harm to our colleagues and our program. So we just want to make sure that we're also not doing harm, of course, to that person, that client, that patient, that student. And I do want to underline, folks, that I intentionally put doing no harm to you first, because it starts there. Yes, and we, of course, Jeffrey, we don't want to do any harm to the profession either. Absolutely, because we can. The whole profession is harmed when, sadly, these boundaries are crossed, in addition to that individual worker, in addition to their colleagues, their organization, maybe even the full client population, because maybe they lose trust. Yeah, and it can take one person to create havoc. Absolutely. I'm going to share my screen again. And our goal is the desire to maintain healthy and trusting professional relationships. We definitely are hoping and working toward doing that. So again, we know that the professional should be responsible for setting and maintaining boundaries, not exploit the trust in the client relationship, not enter into, this is the bright line, dating, sexual relationships, violating those professional boundaries, and not make any inappropriate physical contact. These are often the bright lines and the shoulds. And again, of course, never engage in any sexual contact with the client. And again, we've identified honestly as a learning community how these particular things can still happen, even though we know that these are things we shouldn't do. One thing that can be helpful is we can ask ourselves these questions related to boundaries. You know, if boundaries are starting to get fuzzy or I'm letting them slide, am I making some kind of decision around this because I'm uncomfortable? Am I sure that this is best for the client? And PS, as was talked about in the beginning of our learning community conversation, have I talked about this with my colleagues or my supervisor? And am I possibly denying my client, student, or patient an opportunity to grow? Am I making this decision because it's the easiest thing to do? Because maybe it's harder to enforce the boundary. A number of people who've participated in this learning community conversation have told me that these particular questions are things that they find helpful as guidelines to ask themselves when they're starting to feel unsure about establishing and maintaining boundaries. So again, they're included here as a particular resource. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to advance us to the scenario that I'd like to share with you. And I'm simply going to ask you to read this scenario, and I think the computer is going to read it to you as well. But I'm going to ask you to read this scenario, and I'm going to advance us to that particular slide. As I said, yep, Carrie, you're going to get a copy of these slides that actually will have these questions. Yep, you will get a copy of the slides, and it has those questions, and it has everything else that I said was kind of an opportunity as kind of a refresher review that you can do on your own and also share with your colleagues. Again, there's information here about professionalism. These are about lapses in professionalism. Again, we've already touched on dual relationships, but I really do want to get us to this scenario. And there it is.
Sergio.
So before we go into the scenario, again, I'm going to ask you to just read and listen to the scenario. And then I'm going to just ask you for your gut reaction. Like, what's your first gut reaction? And don't judge it. Whatever your gut reaction is, please bring that to when I take the screen down and we engage in a discussion about it. So I'm going to let you read this, and then I'm going to just ask for your gut reaction to it. And I'm going to let the computer read it to you too. I wanted to make sure we got to touch on this together.
Sergio was removed from his biological parents at age 10 due to abuse and neglect, and lived in foster homes until his mother was able to regain custody of him when he was 15. Sergio is now a case manager at a social service agency. When he is assigned the case of Jonathan Chavez, he sees many similarities between Jonathan's history and his own. During his initial meeting with Jonathan's parents, Sergio discloses many details about his own history and informs the parents of the steps his mother went through, including inpatient rehab, intensive therapy, and taking psychotropic medication that helped her turn her life around. Based on what he has read in previous social worker reports, he informs Jonathan's mother that she sounds a lot like his mom and suggests that she be evaluated for psychotropic meds.
So that's the scenario. And I'm asking, what's your gut reaction to that scenario? Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Too much information. The first sentence I saw when he talked about him, his mother, that is too much information. That's none of her business, and it's none of his to tell her that. He needs to be telling that to his supervisor and not the patient if he feel like that.
Okay. Okay. So you're identifying that it's too much personal disclosure. You're also identifying, Michelle, that this is something that he should be talking with his supervisor about.
I strongly love supervision, And I believe in self-honesty. And if it helps you, you'll be a better clinician if you have the ability to tell the truth on you.
Excellent.
So if he feel he got to open his mouth about his past, tell your supervisor. Don't tell the patient, the client.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Kristen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, my
Gut
initial
reaction. Yeah, go ahead.
my gut reaction was yikes. And then I
You're
was like,
alone.
is that the mom's goal? Like you're having some countertransference where you're assuming that this client's mom's goal is the same as what your mom's goal was, which is not appropriate. Like it's not our job to tell people what they need to do. And then finally, like, are you a physician? Are you a doctor? Why are you giving medical advice? Those were like the first couple things.
Got it. Got it. And Kristen, would it be okay before we hear from somebody else? And a lot of people are putting some things in the chat, which is fantastic. But if it's okay, Kristen, can I ask you a quick follow-up question?
For sure.
If I was Jonathan and you were my supervisor, how would you begin a conversation with me about this interaction? Because I am going to assume, and I could be wrong and Michelle will tell me, but I'm going to assume based on Michelle's reaction that she thinks that as a clinician or as a worker, supervision and support could help me to become a better clinician. And yes, this was a misstep and I could learn from it. And I don't want to assume that that's what Michelle was implying, but that's what I felt. So Michelle, before we go to what Kristen might say if she was my supervisor, am I correct in assuming that that's what you were implying? That if I were the worker and I engaged in supervision and I was honest, that I could recover from this misstep. Am I correct in assuming that, Michelle, or did I misread you?
You could, but the part about helping you to be a better clinician, I don't know if that's a fact, but it's possible. Then again, it doesn't have to be.
Okay. Thank you. So Kristen, if you were my supervisor and I was that worker, how do you think that you would begin to address this situation? Because clearly boundaries have been crossed and something needs to be addressed here. So, and Anita agrees with that, I think. So how would you begin this conversation?
Oh man. So
you can pass if you want to.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think initially I would have to have a frank and honest conversation, like, what were you hoping to accomplish? Like, what was the goal of this conversation? Like, why did you get into the field? And then I would
some open-ended questions to try and understand.
Yeah, and like also advice that I was given when I started in leadership was take it back to like ethics, right? So like or policy. Always go back to policy. What is the policy for your agency? What is there a policy on self-disclosure? Is there a policy on things like that? I would also look at job description. Like, what does your job description say? So are you there to provide resources? Are you there to tell them what they're supposed to, like, what is your role, and like kind of like clarifying that role more. And then also talk about like the harm of telling people what they should do and the harm that like too much self-disclosure can do to a therapeutic relationship. And also I would probably be shadowing some sessions moving forward to see how those things go. I think that it could, like, I think obviously if someone you don't know what you don't know. So if I say, hey, you made this one mistake, you can never recover, like, what are we doing in counseling then? You know what I mean? Like, people make mistakes every day. We can make different choices, but that person would have to make the active decision to kind of like use their experience to support their role and what they're trying to do in their job, but also like not make every client you come across's experience your own experience, if that makes sense.
Makes complete sense. Absolutely. And what I want to underline, Kristen, and thank you for being willing to jump in and elaborate on that. Because your first, when I asked you that, you were like, wow, that's a little like, I don't know. Let me give that some thought. You laid out a very comprehensive approach to it. Okay. And you said something that I really, 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 really want to underline, because I think it's essential to this conversation about ethics and professional boundaries and the process of professionalism. And Kristen, I'm going to quote you. I hope. I think I heard Kristen say, we make mistakes every day. And we have the potential to learn from those mistakes. And I'm going to add this, Kristen, and tell me if you're okay with it. We have the potential to learn from those mistakes before those mistakes become harms, before those mistakes become crossing of bright red lines. Are you okay with that, Kristen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So does anybody else want to share? Octavius, I see that you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
Yeah. Once he researched the background of this particular client, I think he could have went to his supervisor and realized that he may be at a level of his incompetency because of his life experiences.
Okay.
If he have never got counseling himself for what he just been through,
yep,
and this client is too close to something, let's assume that he never did.
Yep.
He had an opportunity to ask the supervisors for support because of why he feel that I couldn't do this by myself at this stage.
Yep.
And it was an opportunity for him to level. Let me rephrase it. Opportunity for him to learn his limits. I can't work with this type of client at this time of my career.
Yep.
And the supervisor should have supported him, helped him get through this, and hopefully steered him towards counseling, getting counseling himself, because there will be other clients, and hopefully he can get help.
Okay. Excellent. And again, as Kristen wrote in the chat, I think you and she are on the same page in some ways in regard to that. And I think what you're identifying is helping the worker to identify one of his triggers. This particular scenario is particularly potent for him, and it caused him to inappropriately self-disclose, and it caused him to work outside of the bounds of what his role or his job is. And I'm going to go out on a limb. And if you think I've gone too far out on a limb, pull me back. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I have a feeling he did this because he was really trying to help. Is that fair, Jean? Do you think it was that maybe he was really trying to help?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I want to go out on a limb because the evidence is not really there in the text, but it sort of reminds me of situations, not necessarily in a professional situation, but I wonder if almost any case, if he really hasn't dealt with his own trauma, I can see a scenario where almost any case he gets, he's going to see the parallels, or he's going to find parallels, or he's going to draw parallels that aren't there to his own experience. So yeah, he really needs some help sort of drawing up boundaries and also sort of recognizing triggers and dealing with what he went through.
Absolutely. And Jean, I want to link what you just said exactly to what Octavia said, because I couldn't agree with you both more. And Kristen, you alluded to this in your comprehensive strategy, is that clearly as an individual, just like myself as an individual, I had my own work to do in order to manage my own life experience. But this particular person clearly has work that they need to do so that they're not seeing themselves in every scenario and they're not triggered to help in this perhaps ineffective way of helping. So I agree that they have an opportunity for growth professionally as well as personally in regard to this. Octavius, did you want to add something else?
Yes, because even I myself, I found my level of incompetency that I cannot work with a child molester. I realized at one point when I was working with them, I worked, I did the job, but it took a lot out of me. I genuinely did not want to help him. I wanted to hurt him. But I didn't do it. I didn't do that. But I made sure going forward, I never had another child molester as a client.
Understood. And again, folks, I think part of professionalism, professional boundaries, and ethics is the willingness to know yourself and to know where you're coming from and to know what your limitations actually are. Now, I'm going to throw out a scenario. Well, I'm going to say I'm going to share an original thought that I had when I read this scenario or when I hear this scenario. And this is not the first time I've seen this scenario. I mean, and I actually wrote this scenario or edited it. So I'm very familiar with it. And what I want to add is that a question that came up for me immediately, and this is just where I sit, okay? A question that came up for me immediately is, who is this guy's client? Is it the mother or is it somebody else? So that question kind of came up for me that I would need to get some clarity in my head about, and I mean, I know it's not the mother, but here he is, because of his traumatic experience, because of what may be unresolved for him, he's making the mother the client and she isn't the client. And then he's going way outside the field. And I also tried on Kristen's supervisory hat. I tried to imagine myself in supervision with this person. And I might say something like this, if indeed I were in supervision with Sergio, because Jonathan Chavez is the client, Sergio is the worker. I might say to Sergio something to the effect of this, and I'm very curious as to your response about this. Sergio, thanks for making the time to meet for supervision today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about the notes I read that you, with this particular case, with Jonathan Chavez and his family. And, I'd like to know a little bit about what your thoughts were about how that conversation went. So I'd start, and Kristen, I'm stealing from you dramatically as I do this. I would start with wanting to get his take on what he said. And then I would listen to what he said. I would be listening for how he responded to that. And then I might say something to the effect of him, as I reviewed your notes, Sergio, a concern comes up for me. And I wanted to check that out with you if that's okay. And my hope is because I would be engaging with him in a respectful way. We have a collaborative partnership. He would say, yeah, of course, please share your concern with me. And I might say something to the effect of, I noticed that during the conversation, as you described it in the notes, that you were seeing a lot of parallels between your own experience and what was going on with Jonathan Chavez's mother. And there was a lot of personal self-disclosure in that conversation. And I'd like to get a sense of, what was your thinking or feeling behind making so much personal disclosure, and what did you see as the purpose of that personal disclosure? So I would ask those two open-ended questions. about why were you talking so much about your own personal experience and what was the purpose behind that. So I would invite him to talk about that. So I'm just going to pause there and ask if anybody has any thoughts or any, yeah, and Jeffrey's saying maybe it was liberating to him. Absolutely. But again, whose session? Go ahead, Anita. Go ahead. Any thought or any reaction to my approach so far to the supervision?
Yeah, I'm going to back up a little bit because your question originally was, how would you initiate the conversation with him?
Yeah.
On that. And so I learned something along, just putting this out there, a long time ago from a very, what I felt was a strong mentor. The word because, when one uses the word because, anything after that is going to communicate your perception of things right there. So I think the question I would probably open with is why? Why did you go about this the way you did, saying what you did? And you're going to get an answer that kind of starts with because, right? And there's the individual's perspective right there, clearly on why. Okay. And so there's going to be a lot of self-disclosure right there on, and as we said, he was probably trying to do good.
Yeah.
Right. But in his way, it's crossing some boundaries there. So I just wanted to throw that out there. The word because just keeps coming through my head. It's probably going to be in the narrative of what was explained, how it was explained.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for adding that and for sharing what your mentor shared with you.
Absolutely.
And the thing I would really like to underline, folks, is I think the message I'd really like you to take away from this scenario is, and as Kristen said early on, it is possible to misstep. It is almost inevitable that we will misstep. And missteps don't have to turn into harms. They can be explored, reflected upon, and we can learn from them, and we can adjust how we proceed. In this scenario, the thing that I would hope to achieve if I was a supervisor is I would hope to achieve to raise Sergio's awareness around self-disclosure. And I would hope to raise Sergio's awareness around the possibility of seeking additional support for unresolved personal trauma. So those are the things that I would be trying to make sure were really underlined and on the table in this conversation. And it is possible for people to learn to resolve unresolved trauma and to be able to check their desire to over disclose. So I love this scenario because it's provocative, and I love it because it's a reminder that with talking about it, with reflecting on it, with receiving supervision around it, we can grow from missteps that we might make in terms of professional boundaries or ethics. Having said that, folks, I cannot thank you enough for such a rich opportunity to focus on this topic. I cannot thank you enough for everything that you brought to this particular conversation. I'm going to advance this to the last slide so that you have access to the QR code that you can scan for the evaluation, and my colleague will put the live link in the chat for you to be able to scan that or to click on that, and that will take you right to the evaluation. Thank you so much, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you in a future learning community conversation on this topic, or certainly other topics as well. There's the QR code. You can scan that with your smartphone. That will take you right to the evaluation. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here.